the Catholic Men's Podcast, helping you find good works of literature for the Catholic gentleman. In the 7th century, a monk from Crediton, Devonshire, went to Germany to teach the Word of God. His name was St. Boniface. Tradition has it that he used the triangular shape of the fir tree to describe the Holy Trinity of God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The converted people began to revere the fir tree as God's tree, as they had previously revered the oak. Pointing to it, the holy man said, "This little tree, a young child of the forest, shall be your holy tree tonight. It is the sign of an endless life, for its leaves are evergreen. See how it points upward to heaven? Let this be called the tree of the Christ child. Gather about it, not in the wild wood, but in your own homes. There it will shelter no deeds of blood, but loving gifts and rites of kindness." You may think that the Christmas tree tradition started with St. Boniface, but its use to commemorate the birth of Christ dates much farther back than the 7th century. It is the night of our Savior's birth. The heavenly star shines brilliantly in the sky, a beacon guiding the shepherds to the heavenly manger. When the shepherds went to adore the divine infant, they decided to take him fruits and flowers from the area. After this harvest, the plants congratulated themselves on being able to offer something to their newly born creator. One had given its apples, another its chestnuts, and so on.
"We are the finest and tastiest variety of apples. My tree produces the most luscious and colorful fruit in the land."
"I'm the poinsettia, and you pale in comparison to my exquisite red hues that adorn all the churches of our nation."
"Are you forgetting me, the glorious chestnut with its nutty treat? I'm the ingredient that brings families together around the fireplace. Every child wants to taste what I have to offer."
From the fir tree, however, the shepherds had taken nothing because its needle-like leaves and sharp cones were not presentable gifts.
"With my prickly needles, I have nothing to give."
He didn't feel worthy to participate in the conversation, but prayed in silence.
"My newly born God, what can I offer you? I offer you my poor and unworthy existence. This I gladly give you in gratitude for having created me in your wisdom and goodness."
God was pleased with the humility of the fir tree, and as a reward, ordered a multitude of little stars to come down from heaven to adorn it. The stars were of many colors: gold, silver, red, and blue.
"Hey, why's the fir tree so special?"
"He's just a big piece of firewood."
When a group of shepherds passed by, they not only took the fruits of the other plants, but they also took the whole fir tree, as such a marvel had never before been seen. Thus, the fir tree ended up by decorating the grotto of Bethlehem, being placed very close to the child Jesus, Our Lady, and Saint Joseph. On the more profound meaning of the tree of Christ, the late Professor Plinio Correa de Oliveira explains, "Each feast of the liturgical calendar brings an effusion of special graces with it. Whether men want or not, grace knocks at the door of their souls in a more sublime, meeker, more insistent way during the Christmas season." Every tree in the forest gave what they could to commemorate the Christ child's birth. And you? The time has come to consider what you are going to offer the child Jesus this Christmas. Dear Mother, I'm writing from the trenches. It's 11 o'clock in the morning. Beside me is a coke fire, opposite me a dugout, wet with straw in it. The ground is sloppy in the actual trench, but frozen elsewhere. In my mouth is a pipe presented by the Princess Mary. In the pipe is tobacco. Of course, you say. But wait, in the pipe is German tobacco. Ha, you say, from a prisoner or found in a captured trench? Oh dear no, from a German soldier. Yes, a live German soldier from his own trench. Yesterday the British and Germans met and shook hands in the ground between the trenches, and exchanged souvenirs and shook hands. Yes, all day Christmas Day, and as I write. Marvelous, isn't it? Private Henry Williamson, age 19, London Rifle Brigade. Late on Christmas Eve 1914, men of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, heard German troops in the trenches opposite them singing carols and patriotic songs, and saw lanterns and small fir trees along their trenches. Messages began to be shouted back and forth between the lines. The following day, British and German soldiers met in no man's land and exchanged gifts, took photographs, and some played impromptu games of football. They also buried casualties and repaired trenches and dugouts. Captain R.J. Arms wrote to his wife just before dawn, "I was in my dugout reading a paper, and the mail was being dished out. It was reported that the Germans had lighted their trenches up all along the front. We had been calling to one another for some time Christmas wishes and other things. I went out and they shouted, 'No shooting!' And then somehow the scene became a peaceful one. All our men got out of the trenches and sat on the parapet. The Germans did the same, and they talked to one another in English and broken English. I got on top of the trench and talked German and asked them to sing a German Volkslied, which they did, and our men sang quite well, and each side clapped and cheered the other. I asked a German who sang a solo to sing one of the Schumann songs, so he sang the Two Grenadiers splendidly. Our men were a good audience, and really enjoyed his singing."
We were in the front line. We were about 300 yards from the Germans. On Christmas Eve we'd been singing carols and this, that and the other, and the Germans had been doing the same, and we'd been shouting to each other, sometimes rude remarks, more often just joking remarks. A German said, "Tomorrow, you no shoot, we no shoot."
This is an interview of Marmaduke Leslie Walkington, a British private who served with the Queen's Westminster Rifles on the Western Front during 1914. He actually witnessed the Christmas Truce.
And the morning came and we didn't shoot and they didn't shoot. And so then we began to pop our heads over the side and jump down quickly in case they shot, but they didn't shoot. And then we saw a German standing up waving his arms and we didn't shoot, and so on. And so it gradually grew. An Englishman and a German met halfway across no man's land, and they shook hands and laughed and joked and waved to their companions to come out and join them, and we streaked out. It was really rather like a crowd at a football match, you know. People from both sides streaming out. And we met in no man's land, and we spent the day there, and we swapped cigarettes, and we gave them rum and they gave us cognac. We exchanged odd little bits of food, just like a lot of boys from neighboring schools.
What I absolutely love about his interview is that he takes away all doubt as to the militance of these men, even while they were doing this truce. They knew they were going to go right back to war, but that's the point. They both believed in their position, and they weren't going to back down, but they were going to be chivalrous about it.
What did you talk about?
I don't think we discussed the war itself all that much. I'm quite sure that we didn't say, "This is silly, let's chuck it all together." We didn't, neither side talked like that at all. We all remained absolutely loyal to our side. And it was perfectly clear to both sides that at the end of the day we would go back and we would start killing each other again.
Did officers take part in this truce?
Not much. A German officer I know, I didn't know at the time, but I've seen a photograph since. A German officer came and took a photograph of mingled troops. Our own officers were a bit scared. They thought they'd be court-martialed and all that. In fact, one, I think it was Srian Cahoon or somebody, who was actually court-martialed for, but I don't think they did much about it, but fraternizing with the enemy was, of course, against military rules.
I believe you have here a letter that you sent home to your family at the time. Would you like to read out about?
I wrote, "My dear father, mother and girls, just a line to let you know that I have had quite a merry Christmas. Would you believe it? By mutual consent, our battalion and the Germans opposite had a little armistice. Of course, we didn't talk about who was going to win. They had just heard that Germans had taken Buckingham Palace. Their clothes were not very good, and they seemed a bit jealous of our goat-skin coats. They had got half Wellington boots and grey uniforms, and wore little round hats without peaks. Of course, none of us carried rifles. It was a beautiful day. The ground was white with frost. Some of them were trying to arrange a football match, but it didn't come off. Talk about peace and goodwill, I never saw a friendlier sight. We tried to explain to each other that we bore no malice. They were not nearly so strong-looking as English fellows, and some were much smaller even than I. I feel much more confident about a bayonet charge now. I believe they usually run away before our fellows get within 50 yards.
This is an excerpt from a book called Silent Night by Stanley Weintraub. In daylight, Christmas cheer was inhibited by the decaying shapes of the dead, some mercifully covered by new snow. So in the grey light of dawn, German soldier Klim wrote, "Our platoon commander, Lieutenant Gross, met an English officer and agreed to bury the dead between the two lines if the higher authorities gave their assent." In the darkness the night before, the English lieutenant had warily directed fire against the emerging parapet Christmas trees. Soon few would care about higher authority. "We gravely saluted each other," a lieutenant on the other side recalled, "and I then pointed to 9 dead Germans lying in midfield and suggested burying them, which both sides proceeded to do. We gave them some wooden crosses, which completely won them over, and soon the men were on the best of terms and laughing. Several Germans spoke very fair English, and some hailed from London, much to our Cockney's delight, and talk became general about Piccadilly." Here's a part of the book that expresses the chivalry that I was talking about. "Why did you and the German commander take your hats off to one another?" a soldier asked Adams afterward. He explained that the German had taken out his cigar case and offered a cigar. "May I be allowed not to smoke?" asked the abstemious Adams, "but to keep this as a souvenir of Christmas here, and of meeting you on Christmas Day?" "Ah, yeah," said the German soldier with a laugh, "but can't you give me a souvenir?" Adams dug into the lining of his cap for a copy of The Soldier's Prayer. "Shield us in danger's hour. Hear my prayer for my comrades in this great war. Incline their hearts to think of thee. Keep the officers who lead us. Help us all to render them cheerful obedience." Removing his own hat, the Oberstlieutenant put the slip in it. "I value this because I believe what it says," he assured Adams. "And when the war is over, I shall take it out and give it as a keepsake to my youngest child." The truce was not observed everywhere along the Western Front. Elsewhere the fighting continued, and casualties did occur on Christmas Day. Some officers were unhappy at the truce and worried that it would undermine fighting spirit. After 1914, the high commands on both sides tried to prevent any truces on a similar scale happening again. Despite this, there were some isolated incidents of soldiers holding brief truces later in the war, and not only at Christmas. Not all soldiers and officers at the front during the Christmas Truce of 1914 approved of it. No one should be surprised that young Adolf Hitler did not. Hitler, a corporal, had been awarded the Iron Cross, second class, by Kaiser William personally. Regarding the truce, Hitler said, "Such a thing should not happen in wartime. Have you no German sense of honor left at all?" But that's the thing. It was a sense of German honor. I think it was what was left of chivalry at that time, and that's why I like this story so much. Thank y'all so much for listening, and Merry Christmas. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. The Catholic Men's Podcast, Episode 35, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I'm only going to be reading what is, for me, the best part of the book, which is when Marley visits Scrooge. If you want to see what happens in the end, you should read the rest for yourself, if you don't know already. This story is a classic that every young man should read anyway, especially around Christmas time. Charles Dickens was a writer genius. He makes a scene about a ghost, something that should be pretty scary, into a witty exchange that almost makes me laugh because of its dry wit. At the same time, his description of Scrooge's vices are so vivid that it makes everyone examine their own consciences for the times in their life when they were a little humbug, because we can all have a little bit of Scrooge in us sometimes. And the last thing I wanted to say is that Charles Dickens made it clear that before we start the tale, he wanted everyone to know that Marley was dead to begin with, as dead as a coffin nail. Okay, now we can begin. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy set of rooms in a lowering pile of building up a yard, where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide-and-seek with other houses, and have forgotten the way out again. It was old enough now, and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and frost so hung about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. Now it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residency in that place. Also that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London, even including, which is a bold word, the corporation alderman in livery. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not an impenetrable shadow, as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred, as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That and its livid color made it horrible, but its horror seemed to be in spite of the face and beyond its control, rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, It was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy would be untrue. But he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause with a moment's irresolution before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it at first, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door, except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on, so he said, "Bah! Humbug!" and closed it with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs, slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. You may talk vaguely about driving a coach and six up a good old flight of stairs, or through a bad young Act of Parliament, but I mean to say you might have got a hearse up that staircase, and taken it broadwise with the splinter bar towards the door and the door towards the balustrades, and done it easy. There was plenty of width for that, and room to spare, which was perhaps the reason why Scrooge thought he saw a locomotive hearse going on before him in the gloom. Half a dozen gas lamps out of the street wouldn't have lighted the entry too well, so you may suppose that it was pretty dark with Scrooge's dip. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel, Scrooge had a cold in his head, upon the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual, old fire guard, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, washing stand on 3 legs, and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in, double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed, nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all round with quaint Dutch tiles, designed to illustrate the Scriptures. There were Cains and Abels, Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers descending through the air on clouds like feather-beds, Abrahams, Belshazzars, apostles putting off to sea in butter boats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts, and yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like the ancient prophet's rod and swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been a blank at first, with power to shape some picture on its surface from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of old Marley's head on every one. "Humbug!" said Scrooge, and walked across the room. After several turns, he sat down again. As he threw his head back in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with the chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment, and with a strange, inexplicable dread, that as he looked, he saw this bell began to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute, or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun, together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise, deep down below, as if some persons were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts and haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards the door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His color changed, though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up as though it cried, "I know him! Marley's ghost!" and then fell again. The same face. The very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights, and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail, and his coat skirts and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, and deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him, and looking through his waistcoat, could see 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now. Though he looked the phantom through and through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about his head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before, he was still incredulous, and fought against his senses. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice. No doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you, then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade." He was going to say to a shade, but substituted this as more appropriate. "In life I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Do it, then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that in the event of its being impossible might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your own senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheat. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. Ha! There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. To sit staring at those fixed glazed eyes in silence for a moment would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of his own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was clearly the case, for though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair and skirts and tassels were still agitated as by the hot vapor from an oven. "You see this toothpick?" said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge, for the reason just assigned, and wishing, though it were only for a second, to divert the vision's stony gaze from himself. "I do," replied the ghost. "You are not looking at it," said Scrooge. "But I see it," said the ghost, "notwithstanding." "Well," returned Scrooge, "I have but to swallow this, and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug!" At this the spirit raised a frightful cry, and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when, the phantom taking off the bandage round his head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees, and clasped his hands before his face. "Mercy," he said. "Dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?" "Man of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "I do," said Scrooge. "I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?" "It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide, and if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turned to happiness." Again the spectre raised a cry, and shook its chain, and wrung its shadowy hands. "You are fettered," said Scrooge, trembling. "Tell me why." "I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "I made it, link by link, and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?" Scrooge trembled more and more. "Or would you know," pursued the ghost, "the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain." Scrooge glanced about him on the floor in the expectation of finding himself suddenly surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. "Jacob," he said imploringly, "oh, Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob." "I have none to give," the ghost replied. "It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all permitted to me. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting-house. Mark me, in life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me." It was a habit with Scrooge, whenever he became thoughtful, to put his hands in his breeches pockets, pondering on what the ghost had said. He did so now, but without lifting up his eyes or getting off his knees. "You must have been very slow about it, Jacob," Scrooge observed in a businesslike manner, though with humility and deference. "Slow?" the ghost repeated. 7 years dead," mused Scrooge, "and traveling all the time." "The whole time," said the ghost. "No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse." "You travel fast," said Scrooge. "On the wings of the wind," replied the ghost. "You might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years," said Scrooge. The ghost, on hearing this, set up another cry, and clanked its chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward would have been justified in indicting it for a nuisance. "Oh, captive bound and double-ironed," cried the phantom, "not to know that ages of incessant labor by immortal creatures, for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life's opportunities misused. Yet such was I, oh, such was I." "But you were always a good man of business, Jacob," faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. "Business!" cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." It held up its chain at arm's length, as if that were the cause of all its unveiling grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. "At this time of the rolling year," the spectre said, "I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me?" Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. "Hear me!" cried the ghost. "My time is nearly gone." "I will," said Scrooge. "But don't be hard upon me, Jacob. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray." How it is that I appear before you in a shape that you can see, I may not tell. I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day." It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow. "That is no light part of my penance," pursued the ghost. "I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. A chance and hope of my procuring, Ebenezer." "You were always a good friend to me, Jacob," said Scrooge. "Thank ye." "You will be haunted," resumed the ghost, "by 3 spirits." Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost's had done. "Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob?" he demanded in a faltering voice. "It is." I think I'd rather not," said Scrooge. "Without their visits," said the ghost, "you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. "Couldn't I take 'em all at once and have it over, Jacob?" hinted Scrooge. "Expect the second on the next night at the same hour. The third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that, for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us." When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table and bound it round its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound its teeth made when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude, with its chain wound over and about its arm. The apparition walked backward from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped, not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear, for on the raising of the hand he became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity. He looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and mourning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few, they might be guilty governments, were linked together. None were free. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat, with a monstrous iron safe attached to its ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human matters, and had lost the power forever. Whether these creatures faded into the mist, or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell, but they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he had walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double-locked, as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say, "Humbug," but stopped at the first syllable, and being, from the emotion he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, went straight to bed, without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. I hope you enjoyed A Christmas Carol. It's one of my favorite books ever. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a very merry and blessed Christmas. Bah, humbug.
A Child's Christmas in Wales by Dylan Thomas. This is an excellent Christmas monologue. It's not really a poem, even though some people call it that. For me, reading this story or listening to it is one of the best things about Christmas, because it talks about a time that has been long past, when boys could be boys, when Christmas was so special, and the whole day was filled with mystery and childish innocence. But I have to say that there are some parts that can be a bit deep, but just hang on through them because there's an excellent part at the end where they meet this ghost, and the ending is really the best part. So here is A Child's Christmas in Wales by Dylan Thomas. One Christmas was so much like another in those years, around the sea-town corner now, and out of all sound, except the distant speaking of the voices, I sometimes hear a moment before sleep that I never can remember whether it snowed for 6 days and 6 nights when I was 12, or whether it snowed for 12 days and 12 nights when I was 6. All the Christmases roll down toward the two-tongued sea like a cold and headlong moon bundling down the sky that was our street, and they stop at the rim of the ice-edged, fish-freezing waves, and I plunge my hands in the snow and bring out whatever I can find. In goes my hand into that wool-white, bell-tongued ball of holidays resting at the rim of the carol-singing sea, and out come Mrs. Prothero and the firemen. It was on the afternoon of the Christmas Eve, and I was in Mrs. Prothero's garden, waiting for cats, with her son Jim. It was snowing. It was always snowing at Christmas. December in my memory is as white as Lapland, though there were no reindeer, but there were cats. Patient, cold, and callous, our hands wrapped in socks, we waited to snowball the cats. Sleek and long as jaguars, and horrible-whiskered, spitting and snarling, they would slink and sidle over the white back garden walls, and the lynx-eyed hunters, Jim and I, fur-capped and moccasined trappers from Hudson Bay, off Mumble's Road, would hurl our deadly snowballs at the green of their eyes. The wise cats never appeared. We were so still, Eskimo-footed Arctic marksmen in the muffling silence of the eternal snows, eternal ever since Wednesday, that we never heard Mrs. Prothero's first cry from her igloo at the bottom of the garden. Or if we heard it at all, it was to us like the far-off challenge of our enemy and prey, the neighbor's polar cat. But soon the voice grew louder. "Fire!" cried Mrs. Prothero, and she beat the dinner gong. And we ran down the garden with the snowballs in our arms toward the house, and smoke indeed was pouring out of the dining room, and the gong was bombulating, and Mrs. Prothero was announcing ruin like a town crier in Pompeii. This was better than all the cats in Wales standing on the wall in a row. We bounded into the house, laden with snowballs, and stopped at the open door of the smoke-filled room. Something was burning, all right. Perhaps it was Mr. Prothero, who always slept there after midday dinner with a newspaper over his face. But he was standing in the middle of the room, saying, "A fine Christmas," and smacking at the smoke with his slipper. "Call the fire brigade," cried Mrs. Prothero as she beat the gong. "They won't be there," said Mr. Prothero. "It's Christmas." There was no fire to be seen, only clouds of smoke, and Mr. Prothero standing in the middle of them, waving his slipper as though he were conducting. "Do something," he said, and we threw all our snowballs into the smoke. I think we missed Mr. Prothero, and ran out of the house to the telephone box. "Let's call the police as well," Jim said, "and the ambulance. And Ernie Jenkins, he likes fires." But we only called the fire brigade, and soon the fire engine came, and 3 tall men in helmets brought a hose into the house, and Mr. Prothero got out just in time before they turned it on. Nobody could have had a noisier Christmas Eve. And when the firemen turned off the hose and were standing in the wet, smoky room, Jim's aunt, Miss Prothero, came downstairs and peered in at them. Jim and I waited very quietly to hear what she would say to them. She said the right thing, always. She looked at the 3 tall firemen standing in their shining helmets among the smoke and cinders and dissolving snowballs, and she said, "Would you like anything to read?" Years and years ago, when I was a boy, when there were wolves in Wales, and birds the color of red flannel petticoats whisked past the harp-shaped hills, when we sang and wallowed all night and day in caves that smelt like Sunday afternoons in damp front farmhouse parlors, and we chased, with the jawbones of Dickens, the English and the bears, before the motor car, before the wheel, before the duchess-faced horse, when we rode the daft and happy hills bareback, it snowed and it snowed. But here a small boy says, "It snowed last year, too. I made a snowman, and my brother knocked it down, and I knocked my brother down, and then we had tea. But that was not the same snow, I say. Our snow was not only shaken from whitewash buckets down the sky, it came shawling out of the ground, and swam and drifted out of the arms and hands and bodies of the trees. Snow grew overnight on the roofs of the houses like a pure and grandfather moss, minutely ivied the walls, and settled on the postman opening the gate like a dumb, numb thunderstorm of white, torn Christmas cards. Were there postmen then, too? With sprinkling eyes and wind-cherried noses on spread frozen feet, they crunched up to the doors and mittened on them manfully, but all the children could hear was a ringing of bells. You mean that the postman went rat-a-tat-tat and the doors rang? I mean that the bells the children could hear were inside them. I only hear thunder sometimes, never bells. There were church bells, too. Inside them? No, 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 in the bat-black snow-white belfries, tugged by bishops and storks, and they rang their tidings over the bandaged town, over the frozen foam of the powder and ice-cream hills, over the crackling sea. It seemed that all the churches boomed for joy under my window, and the weathercocks crew for Christmas on our fence. Get back to the postmen. They were just ordinary postmen, fond of walking and dogs and Christmas in the snow. They knocked on the doors with blue knuckles. Oz has got a black knocker, and then they stood on the white welcome mat in the little drifted porches, and huffed and puffed, making ghosts with their breath, and jogged from foot to foot like small boys wanting to go out. And then the presents? And then the presents, after the Christmas box, and the cold postman, with a rose on his button nose, tingled down the tea-tray slithered run of the chilly, glinting hill. He went in his ice-bound boots like a man on fishmonger's slabs. He wagged his bag like a frozen camel's hump, dizzily turned the corner on one foot, and, by goodness, he was gone. Get back to the presents. There were the useful presents, engulfing mufflers of the old coach days, and mittens made for giant sloths, zebra scarfs of a substance like silky gum that could be tug-o-warred down to the galoshes, blinding tam-o'-shanters like patchwork tea-cozies, and bunny-suited busbies and balaclavas for victims of head-shrinking tribes. From ants who always wore wool next to the skin, there were mustached and rasping vests that made you wonder why the ants had any skin left at all. And once I had a little crocheted nose bag from an ant, now, alas, no longer whinnying with us, and pictureless books in which small boys, though warned with quotations not to, would skate on Farmer Giles's pond, and did, and drowned, and books that told me everything about the wasp, except why. Go on to the useless presents. Bags of moist and many-colored jelly babies, and a folded flag, and a false nose, and a tram conductor's cap, and a machine that punched tickets and rang a bell, never a catapult. Once, by mistake, that no one could explain, a little hatchet, and a celluloid duck that made, when you pressed it, a most unduck-like sound, a mewing moo that an ambitious cat might make who wished to be a cow, and a painting in which I could make the grass, the trees, the sea, and the animals any color I pleased. And still the dazzling sky-blue sheep are grazing in the red field under the rainbow-billed and pea-green birds. Hard-boileds, toffee, fudge, and all sorts, crunches, cracknels, humbugs, glaciers, and marzipan, and butter-welsh for the Welsh, and troops of bright tin soldiers who, if they could not fight, could always run, and snakes and families and happy ladders, and easy hobby games for little engineers, complete with instructions. Easy, oh, easy for Leonardo, and a whistle to make the dogs bark to wake up the old man next door, to make him beat on the wall with his stick to shake our picture off the wall, and a packet of cigarettes. You put one in your mouth, and you stood at the corner of the street, and you waited for hours in vain for an old lady to scold you for smoking a cigarette, and then, with a smirk, you ate it. And then it was breakfast under the balloons. Were there uncles like in our house? There are always uncles at Christmas, the same uncles, and on Christmas morning, with dog-disturbing whistle and sugar fags, I would scour the swatched town for the news of the little world, and find always a dead bird by the post office, or by the white deserted swings, perhaps a robin, all but one of his fires out. Men and women waiting or scooping back from chapel, with taproom noses and wind-bust cheeks, all albinos, huddled their stiff black jarring feathers against the irreligious snow. Mistletoe hung from the gas brackets in all the front parlors. There was sherry and walnuts and bottled beer and crackers by the dessert spoons. And cats in their furabouts watched the fires, and the high-heaped fires spat, all ready for the chestnuts and the mulling pokers. Some few large men sat in their front parlors, without their collars, uncles almost certainly, trying their new cigars, holding them out judiciously at arm's length, returning them to their mouths, coughing, and then holding them out again as though waiting for the explosion, and some few small aunts, not wanted in the kitchen, nor anywhere else for that matter, sat on the very edge of their chairs, poised and brittle, afraid to break, like faded cups and saucers. Not many those mornings trod the piling streets. An old man, always, fawn-bowlered, yellow-gloved, and, at this time of year, with spats of snow, would take his constitutional to the white bowling green and back, as he would take it wet or fire on Christmas Day or Doomsday. Sometimes 2 hale young men, with big pipes blazing, no overcoats and wind-blown scarves, would trudge, unspeaking, down to the forlorn sea to work up an appetite, to blow away the fumes, who knows, to walk into the waves until nothing of them was left but the 2 furling smoke clouds of their inextinguishable briars. Then I would be slap-dashing home, the gravy smell of the dinners of others, the bird smell, the brandy, the pudding and mince, coiling up to my nostrils, when out of a snow-clogged side lane would come a boy the spit of myself, with a pink-tipped cigarette and the violet past of a black eye, cocky as a bullfinch, leering all to himself. I hated him on sight and sound, and would be about to put my dog whistle to my lips and blow him off the face of Christmas, when suddenly he, with a violent wink, put his whistle to his lips, and blew so stridently, so high, so exquisitely loud, that gobbling faces, their cheeks bulged with goose, would press against their tinselled windows the whole length of the white echoing street. For dinner we had turkey and blazing pudding, and after dinner the uncles sat in front of the fire, loosened all buttons, put their large moist hands over their watch chains, groaned a little, and slept. Mothers, aunts, and sisters scuttled to and fro, bearing tureens. Auntie Bessie, who had already been frightened twice by a clockwork mouse, whimpered at the sideboard, and had some elderberry wine. The dog was sick. Auntie Dozy had to have 3 aspirins, but Auntie Hannah, who liked port, stood in the middle of the snow-bound backyard, singing like a big-bosomed thrush. I would blow up balloons to see how big they would blow up to, and when they burst, which they all did, the uncles jumped and rumbled. In the rich and heavy afternoon, the uncles breathing like dolphins and the snow descending, I would sit among festoons and Chinese lanterns and nibble dates and try to make a model man-o'-war, following the instructions for little engineers, and produce what might be mistaken for a sea-going tram-car. Or I would go out, my bright new boots squeaking into the white world, onto the seaward hill, to call on Jim and Dan and Jack, and to pad through the still streets, leaving huge footprints on the hidden pavements. I bet people will think there's been hippos. What would you do if you saw a hippo coming down our street? I'd go like this, bang. I'd throw him over the railings and roll him down the hill, and then I'd tickle him under the ear and he'd wag his tail. What would you do if you saw 2 hippos? Iron-flanked and bellowing he-hippos clanked and battered through the scudding snow toward us as we passed Mr. Daniel's house. Let's post Mr. Daniel a snowball through his letterbox. Let's write things in the snow. Let's write, Mr. Daniel looks like a spaniel all over his lawn. Or we walked on the white shore. Can the fishes see it snowing? The silent, one-clouded heavens drifted on to the sea. Now we were snow-blind travelers lost on the north hills, and vast, dew-lapped dogs, with flasks around their necks, ambled and shambled up to us baying Excelsior. We returned home through the poor streets, where only a few children fumbled with bare red fingers in the wheel-rutted snow and catcalled after us, their voices fading away as we trudged uphill, into the cries of the dock birds and the hooting of ships out in the whirling bay. And then, at tea, the recovered uncles would be jolly, and the ice cake loomed in the center of the table like a marble grave. Auntie Hannah laced her tea with rum because it was only once a year. Bring out the tall tales now that we told by the fire as the gaslight bubbled like a diver. Ghosts hooed like owls in the long nights when I dared not look over my shoulder. Animals lurked in the cubbyhole under the stairs, and the gas meter ticked. And I remember that we went singing carols once, when there wasn't the shaving of a moon to light the flying streets. At the end of a long road was a drive that led to a large house, and we stumbled up the darkness of the drive that night, each one of us afraid, each one holding a stone in his hand in case, and all of us too brave to say a word. The wind through the trees made noises as of old and unpleasant and maybe web-footed men wheezing in caves. We reached the black bulk of the house. What shall we give them? Hark the herald? No, said Jack. Good King Wenceslas, I'll count 3. 1, 2, 3, and we began to sing, our voices high and seemingly distant in the snow-felted darkness round the house that was occupied by nobody we knew. We stood close together near the dark door. Good King Wenceslas looked out on the feast of Stephen, and then a small, dry voice, like the voice of someone who has not spoken for a very long time, joined our singing. A small, dry, eggshell voice from the other side of the door, a small, dry voice through the keyhole. And when we stopped running, we were outside of our house. The front room was lovely. Balloons floated under the hot water bottle gulping gas. Everything was good again, and shone over the town. Perhaps it was a ghost, Jim said. Perhaps it was trolls, Dan said, who was always reading. Let's go in and see if there's any jelly left, Jack said. And we did just that. Always on Christmas night there was music. An uncle played the fiddle, a cousin sang Cherry Ripe, and another uncle sang Drake's Drum. It was very warm in the little house. Auntie Hannah, who had got on to the parsnip wine, sang a song about bleeding hearts and death, and then another in which she said her heart was like a bird's nest, and then everybody laughed again, and then I went to bed. Looking through my bedroom window, out into the moonlight and the unending smoke-colored snow, I could see the lights in the windows of all the other houses on our hill and hear the music rising from them up the long, steady falling night. I turned the gas down. I got into bed. I said some words to the close and holy darkness, and then I slept. End of A Child's Christmas in Wales by Dylan Thomas. Thanks for listening, and have a very merry and blessed Christmas. The Count and the Chimney Sweep by Jean Lenotre. On that Christmas Eve, Mathiote, without changing his begrimed clothes, directed his steps to the palace of de Plessis-Morambert. 3 years earlier, also on Christmas Eve, he had been called to clean a certain chimney, where the Count de Morambert wanted to arrange an enormous pyramid of toys and candles to surprise his son Jacques when he awoke Christmas morning. Now it happened that Mathiote was precisely the same age as the Count's son, and when the Count saw on the little chimney sweep's face the look, not of envy, but of admiration at seeing all those marvels, and at the same time seduced by the intelligent and honest air of the child, he chatted with him for a few moments, gave him a gold coin, and sent him to the pantry to be served a fine supper. The comforting remembrance of that unexpected feast brought the lad to the palace year after year on the same evening to receive his gold louis d'or and bowl of savory soup. If the whole truth must be said, his annual appearance was due not only to the attention paid to him, but also by curiosity and sweetmeats. But on the evening of this December 24th, 1793, the lad was surprised to find the palace, which was full of light and warmth,
cold, dark, and empty. For though he knocked many times on the great door, none of his entreaties were answered. As he sadly turned away, he saw off at the other end of the street, shrouded in the dark shadows, the shapes of a man and small boy rapidly approaching the palace. As they drew near, Matthiot recognized Jacques de Morambert and ran to him. "Ah, it's you, Matthiot. You did come. Let us go inside quickly." As soon as the great door was made fast, Jacques broke into sobs. "My father was arrested 8 days ago by the Revolutionary Committee. They are going to try him in a few days. Oh, Matthiot, my father is lost." And Jacques began to cry even louder. Matthiot, whose humble existence hadn't been affected by the terror, was then told that the Count was accused of horrible crimes and would surely be sent to the guillotine. For 8 days, Jacques had tried to speak to his father, but the guards were cruel men and wouldn't permit it. Fortunately, the Count's cell faced the street, so Jacques was able to see his father and throw him kisses through the bars. The poor lad was just returning from that painful sight when Matthiot met him. "Don't worry, Monsieur Jacques. Those wretches cannot hurt or kill my lord the Count. He is so good, so charitable. But don't you see? It is for that very reason he is lost." After a few moments' thought, Matthiot said, "Take courage and leave it to me." "To you? What can you do? Any attempt to help him will only hasten his execution." And tears again streamed down Jacques' face. Matthiot consoled him as best as he could, then went out into the dark street and headed for the center of Paris, with a quick and almost happy step. The Count of Plessis-Morambert had been imprisoned in l'Abbaye, and his first few hours there had been spent pacing around his cell like a beast in a cage, trying to break the door down or rip the bars off the window or search for some other means of escape. But it was all futile, for the walls were very thick and the door was made of heavy planks, and on it was set a great iron lock with enormous screws. But at last the good Count, exhausted and discouraged, sat down on the dilapidated cane chair and gazed sadly into the fireplace. He thought of little Jacques bathed in tears and all alone in the deserted palace, and he began to pray. He thought of past Christmases when his son was very small, and how, before going to sleep, he would carefully place his tiny shoes on the hearth to wait for the visit of the child Jesus, who never failed to come. But what would Jacques think tomorrow morning when he would wake up and find that the child Jesus had forgotten him? At the thought of that inevitable disappointment, the Count fixed his tear-laden eyes on the lifeless fireplace and thought of those happy nights when he would tiptoe into his sleeping son's room and carefully arrange the toys wrapped in garlands, the little soldiers in the box of carved pine wood, the golden oranges, the crystallized fruits, that paradise of good things a little boy finds upon awaking and delights him with claps and shouts of joy. At this point, the Count's melancholy thoughts were interrupted by a muffled noise in the chimney. Suddenly there came a downpour of soot and ashes, followed by a large, well-wrapped package that hit the hearth and rolled to the middle of the cell. Startled at this strange occurrence, the Count stood up, glancing back and forth at the chimney and the mysterious package. His attention was then caught by something even stranger, for 2 feet appeared in the chimney, dangling in the air, and in an instant a black form dropped out and sprang into the cell, crying, "Don't be afraid, my Lord Count! It is I, Matthiot!" And so it was, with his face and clothes black with soot, his white teeth showing, and his clear eyes shining like stars. The Count, astonished and searching his memory, could only repeat the boy's name. "Matthiot? But I didn't forget you, my Lord Count. I have just come from your palace, and Monsieur Jacques is very sad. But we may speak of him later. I have come to take you out of here, my Lord Count." "You have come to take me out of here?" "Yes, but we have no time to lose. Speak softly. Here, I have everything you need. First, your clothes." And the little chimney sweep quickly unwrapped the package, which contained an adult chimney sweep's outfit that he had obtained from his master, and a roll of gold louis d'or Jacques had given him. "If we're quiet and make haste, my Lord Count, I promise you we shall be in the street in a quarter of an hour." "But how shall we get out, my little one? You surely do not intend to take me out the same way you came in. Even so, where will we be then? On the rooftops? But how did you find my cell?" "Monsieur Jacques told me. The last window on the corner of Sainte Marguerite Street. But if you permit, my Lord Count, when we next speak it should be on the street. I must work, and you must change your clothes." Then Matthiot examined the huge lock, took an instrument from his packet, and began to loosen the long screws holding it to the door, working with precision and agility, the still astonished Count looking on with utter disbelief. At a nod from Matthiot, the silent onlooker began to change into his new garb, and when the rescuer turned around to show his success at removing the lock, he found a full-grown version of himself, and this time he nodded with approval. "You're saved. Now you must hide your money, except for one coin. Follow me, and when we reach the sentinel, go on calmly into the street, and turn left without hesitating. Agreed?" The Count answered by pressing his hand. Matthiot opened the door and peeked into the corridor. Allowing the prisoner to pass through first, he then went out and closed the door softly behind him. At the bottom of the stairs they found the guard fast asleep on a cot inside a windowed cubicle dimly lit by an oil lamp. Matthiot went boldly up to the window and knocked to awaken the guard. "Citizen, let me out." The guard grudgingly got up and shined the light toward the voice, and found only a child burdened by ropes, hooks, and brushes, the chimney sweep tools. Reassured at this sight, he pulled the cord to unlock the door. The Count moved slowly toward the threshold, and almost retreated when, at the sound of the closing door, the guard turned around and caught sight of him. But Matthiot had foreseen everything. "Excuse me, soldier, can you tell me where to find the officer in charge?"
"The officer in charge? What do you want with him? And who is that? No one is allowed through."
"I wanted to give him this gold coin I found when I was cleaning out a chimney. Here, see, I wasn't sure what to do with it." The guard, flattered at Matthiot addressing him as a soldier, examined the coin and quickly gave it the safety of his pocket. 4 louis d'or at that time were worth 200 paper francs.
"A coin for the officer in charge? Don't worry, I'll make sure he gets it. I'm not about to wake him for such a petty sum."
"Oh, thank you, citizen."
"The pleasure is all mine, chimney sweep."
Matthiot darted out the door and ran to catch up with the Count, who meanwhile had been hastily following his rescuer's instructions. The valiant youth well knew that in Paris it would be impossible to hide the aristocrat from the revolutionary police. And besides, who would dare risk his life for the fugitive noble with the whole Committee for Public Safety after him? Matthiot therefore decided to conduct the Count of Savoy to where he would be well cared for by the chimney sweep's good father and mother. The 10-day journey should be a relatively safe one, as 2 Savoyard chimney sweeps returning home could hardly raise any suspicion. As an extra precaution, Matthiot wrapped the Count's head in linen as if he were wounded, but in reality to explain his companion's silence when they were among strangers. After placing what little provisions they had in knapsacks, the Count and chimney sweep set out for Savoy. By the second day out from Paris, the Count de Montembert, little used to walking such distances, deprived of his habitual comforts, and sleeping in an occasional herdsman's hut, no longer had to make an effort to play his role. No one would suspect that this exhausted and battered laborer making his last efforts to reach his homeland was actually a rich noble fleeing the Terror. 12 days after leaving Paris, the fugitives came to the last French village. Though Matthiot was fresh and full of energy, the Count was fatigued and barely able to drag himself forward. The 2 travelers found a humble inn and were ready to begin a meager repast of bread and butter, when the innkeeper, speaking to Matthiot and pointing to the Count, asked, "Is he your father?" "No, monsieur, he's my master's brother."
"What's wrong with him? Is he ill?"
"Very. He fell from a roof and was crippled. I'm taking him home."
Well, where are your passports? What? You can't cross the border without papers. It's guarded by patriots. Just yesterday they caught 2 aristocrats disguised as cheese merchants. Matthiot grew very pale beneath his layers of soot. He hadn't foreseen this, but mastering himself, he replied quite naturally, I only know that we must hasten to arrive quickly. The poor old man can barely walk. You can't cross the border unless you have papers. And the innkeeper walked away without another word. An hour later, the two found themselves in the shade of a tree beside the river, separating France from Savoy. There, only 100 feet away, was freedom. But in between was the bridge guarded by 10 well-armed and cruel revolutionaries. At this last, seemingly unsurmountable obstacle, the Count sighed, Matthiot, so we are lost after all. But my Lord Count, you must make one last effort. We'll cut through the field and cross the river where the ice is thickest. Impossible, my Matthiot. Do you think I could walk on ice when I can barely lift my feet off the ground? Then we'll go to the guardhouse. While I distract the sentries, you muster all your strength and run across the bridge. Run? Only to make an easy target for the sentries' muskets? But they might miss. Perhaps. And what about you? They'll make you pay for your generosity with your life. No, my son, I can never permit that. I'm afraid we have shipwrecked in the sight of land. Go across the fields. I will give myself up when I see you're safe. Matthiot bowed his head, and after a few moments' silence said, We still have one chance. We shall walk calmly down to the guardhouse, and if they ask us for papers, I'll stop and pretend to look for them, but you walk on steadily. Every yard counts. But since we can't be sure of escaping, my Lord Count, you should give me all the gold louis d'or, for if they search you and find all that money, you will be lost. The Count assented with a nod of his head. These last few words of Matthiot suddenly made everything clear. It had been naive for him to believe that such a poor lad would help him, a rich noble, out of pure dedication or gratitude for a few bowls of hot soup. This was the first time he had allowed himself to be deceived by the appearance of a commoner. But experience left no doubt. The young Savoyard had but one intention, to possess the gold coins, which to him was a fortune. The Count removed the money from his wallet and placed them in the hand of the chimney sweep with a gesture of disdain. Then, after wiping his forehead as if to remove the bitterness of disappointment, he rose with great difficulty and said, I am going to give myself up. You try to escape. Yes, let it be every man for himself. No, but I won't let you. You will see, my Lord Count. As the fugitive chimney sweeps reached the guardhouse in their typical garb, the unsuspicious soldiers allowed them to pass with only a few jibes and laughs. But they had taken only a few steps onto the bridge when the officer in charge called out to his men, Hey, boys, look at those two. They're disobeying the order. Hey there, my little one. Come quickly, my Lord Count. We don't hear anything. Just a few more steps. You little knave! Are you going to stop or not? Matthiot turned around with a surprised air and returned to the guard post, where the Count hobbled painfully toward the other side. What do you want, citizen? Where's your passport, and where is he going? Is he deaf? He is terribly wounded. Well, he better stop or we'll shoot. Oh, please don't shoot, citizen. My passport is right here. It's right, But the official wasn't fooled by this maneuver, and he cried out in a terrible voice, Fire! Can't you see that an aristocrat is giving us the slip? Shoot him down! Fire! Fire! But at that instant, Matthiot jumped in front of the leveled muskets, knowing the soldiers would hesitate to shoot an unarmed child. Fire! Fire! He's going to escape! But Matthiot was already filling his hands with the gold louis d'or in his pocket, and suddenly he threw them all at the feet of the soldiers. Then followed an indescribable confusion. At the sight and sound of gold, the soldiers lost their heads, dropped their muskets, and launched themselves after the rolling coins, pushing and shoving with desperation. Matthiot didn't wait to contemplate that epic picture, but in a few leaps joined the Count de Morambert on the other side of the bridge, outside France.
While the soldiers were still fighting over the last piece of gold, the lad threw his beret to the air and shouted in his Savoyard dialect, "Et viva la liberté! Long live liberty!" The boy ran to his companion, and the two, Count and Chimney Sweep, the one weeping with joy and the other with exhaustion and gratitude, tumbled arm in arm into the guardhouse of Savoy. The end of The Count and the Chimney Sweep, from Legend du Noël, Contes historiques, by Jean Lenotre. Merry Christmas to one and all my listeners. This podcast is going to be a compilation of Christmas stories performed by the British TFP Family Series. I discovered this CD when I was in high school, and I can remember putting all of the stories on my MP3 player and listening to it again and again all through the Christmas season. And I've been wanting to put them all on this podcast for a very long time. So here's the compilation. Thank you so much for listening, and Merry Christmas.
And it came to pass that in those days there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that the whole world should be enrolled. This enrolling was first made by Cyrenius, the governor of Syria, and all went to be enrolled, every one into his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family of David, to be enrolled with Mary, his espoused wife, who was with child. And it came to pass that when they were there, her days were accomplished, that she should be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him up in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. The Emperor Augustus then reigned over the East and the West. The nations that had been so proud of their independence, such as Italy, Spain, Africa, Greece, Egypt, Gaul, what is today France, Great Britain, and Asia Minor, now transformed into mere provinces of the Roman Empire, were subject to the laws of their conqueror. Now at that time, the great emperor took a fancy to find out the exact extent of his dominions and the number of his subjects. Consequently, he issued an imperial edict prescribing the taking of a general census of all the peoples. Judea was included in that edict, for Herod's kingdom, being only a simple fief revocable at the will of the emperor, was dependent on the governor of Syria. Orders were issued to the heads of families, to the women and children, to inscribe on the public registers their names, age, family, tribe, their goods and possessions, and whatever else was required to make out the list of the taxes to be levied. Moreover, each one was to be inscribed not at his place of residence, but at the place where his family originally came from, because in such places were preserved the genealogical documents legalizing, in hereditary order, the right to property and inheritance. This latter prescription obliged Joseph and Mary, who were both of the tribe of Judah and of the family of David, to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem, the birthplace of David, their ancestor. Whilst on the way to the mountains of Judah, Mary, who was about to become a mother, admired how God himself led her to the place where the Messiah was to be born, and how an imperial edict set in motion all the nations in the world, in order that a prophecy made 7 centuries previously by a seer of Israel should now be fulfilled. The 2 travelers arrived at Bethlehem exhausted with fatigue after their journey of 66 miles. The evening sun was then shedding its last rays on the city of David, which was seated as a queen on the summit of a hill amid smiling hillocks planted with vines and olive trees. It was really Bethlehem, the house of bread, the town of abundant harvests, Ephrata the fertile, the country of fat pastures. It was in those solitary valleys that young David pastured his flock when the prophet Samuel sent for him in order to anoint him King of Israel. When treading on that blessed soil, the holy travelers conjured up the pious souvenirs of their nation, or rather of their ancestry. From the houses of the town, from the surrounding mountains and valleys, they seemed to hear voices speaking of their ancestors, and especially of the great king whose descendants they were. But at that time, who was acquainted with the Virgin of Nazareth, with Joseph the carpenter? On entering Bethlehem, they felt as if lost among the great number of strangers that had come there from every part of the kingdom to be inscribed in the census. In vain did they knock at every door to find shelter for the night. No one would receive them. The Bethlehemites, having already to lodge their many friends and kinsmen, refused to admit those strangers who seemed so poor and wretched. Joseph and Mary then directed their steps to the public inn, where the caravans usually had their quarters, but they found it so full of travelers and beasts of burden that there was no more room for them. Being repulsed everywhere, these 2 holy persons left the town by the Hebron gate. They had scarcely gone a few steps when they beheld near them a dark cave hewn out of a hillside. The Spirit of God inspired them to enter it. Having gone in, they found that it was a stable, which served as a shelter for the shepherds and their flocks. It contained a manger and a little straw. The daughter of David, after her long and wearisome journey, sat down in it on a block of stone to take a little rest. Soon, the noise in the city ceased altogether, and a solemn silence watched over its sleeping inhabitants. Mary was alone watching in the abandoned grotto, and pouring out her heart to the Almighty, when, at about midnight, the incarnate Word miraculously left the womb of his mother, and like a dazzling ray of the sun, he appeared to her, astonished and enraptured gaze. She adored him, took him up in her arms, wrapped him up in poor swaddling bands, and pressed him to her heart. Then, seeing the crib or manger from which the cattle were wont to feed, she laid him in it on a little straw. And from that stable which sheltered him, from that crib which served him as a cradle, and from that straw on which he lay, and which pained his tender body, the infant Redeemer offered to the divine majesty his very first sufferings and humiliations. Kneeling near him, their eyes bathed in tears, Mary and Joseph united themselves to his sacrifice.
The beautiful custom of setting up mangers to commemorate the birth of the infant Jesus was started by St. Francis of Assisi. It was the year 1223. St. Francis went to Rome to obtain from Pope Honorius III authorization to celebrate Christmas in a totally new way. St. Francis chose a forest in the vicinity of the village of Greccio, in the region of Umbria not too far from Rome, where a good friend of his lived, the noble Giovanni Vellita. About 15 days before Christmas, St. Francis said to him, "If you want to celebrate the feast of the divine birth in Greccio, make haste to prepare what I indicate to you, so that we can properly remember the circumstances in which the divine child was born, and all the inconveniences he endured as he lay in the manger on straw between an ox and an ass. I would like to recreate this in a palpable way, as if I had seen it with my own eyes." Many religious and the residents of Greccio and the surrounding area were all invited for this special commemoration. Just before midnight, the Franciscan friars went in procession to the spot chanting the antiphons of Advent. They were accompanied by the villagers who carried flaming torches. The wind blew strongly, and the light of the torches projected their flickering shadows on the dense forest. However, in the clearance where the crib had been set up, there reigned an ambience of sacrality and peace. Only the cold was a nuisance. When the village bell of Greccio began to toll midnight, a priest began to celebrate Mass. The altar had been placed in front of the crib with the ox and ass on either side. A beautiful full-size statue of the child Jesus rested on the straw. As is well known, St. Francis never wanted to be ordained a priest out of humility. Because of this, as deacon, it was his duty to solemnly sing the gospel of that Christmas Mass. After the reading of the gospel, all waited attentively to hear the sermon that St. Francis himself gave on the grandeurs and mercies of the Saviour of the human race, who, that night, was made flesh and dwelt among us. St. Francis spoke words with a supernatural sweetness about the poverty in which the God-man was born, and about the insignificant city of Bethlehem. It is difficult to imagine the fiery love that the sweet, clear and sonorous voice of St. Francis produced in the hearts of those privileged to hear him. At the end of his sermon, St. Francis bent over to kiss the statue of the divine child. At this moment, a miracle took place that only he and Giovanni Vellita saw. The statue became alive. It was as if it had been woken from a profound sleep with St. Francis's kiss. And then the child Jesus smiled at St. Francis. At the consecration, when the bread and wine truly became the body, blood, soul and divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ, St. Francis was able to contemplate the Messiah in two ways: in the form of the Holy Eucharist and laying in the manger. At the end of the solemn midnight Mass, and after having incensed the manger, the friars returned to Greccio and the villagers to their homes. Everyone was full of supernatural joy. The veracity of this event can be certified by the sanctity of the one who experienced it, as well as by the miracles that happened afterwards. The straw from the manger was carefully kept by the people, and was an efficacious remedy to miraculously cure sick animals and an antidote against many other diseases. This devout and hitherto unknown institution of the manger was enthusiastically received by the faithful. St. Clare of Assisi, disciple of the saint, established it in her convents. Every year she set up the manger herself. The Franciscan friars also spread this custom far and wide. Whether composed of figurines artistically carved from clay, porcelain, or wood, the crib became the very symbol of Christmas. From the majestic cathedral to the simplest rural chapel, from the palace or mansion to the humblest abode, the Catholics of the whole world since that time have had the pious custom of setting up a manger. In this way, they repeat the custom that Providence inspired from the seraphic St. Francis of Assisi in the remote year of 1223.
Once upon a time, there lived in the faraway deserts of Arabia a very poor boy. His mother had died when he was still very young, and his father was the guardian of a well where the caravans of travelers stopped to slake their thirst on the way across the desert. Then, crowds of men would arrive with many camels, and everyone was busy getting water from the well. This was how the poor man earned his living, but it was not well paid, and so he never had enough money to buy any toys for his little boy. The guardian of the well loved his little son, and he sighed on seeing him without toys. He wanted his boy to be able to entertain himself like any other child. So, one day he made him a drum from a sheep's skin stretched over a small barrel that had lost its bottom. From that day onwards, the little boy was never seen without his drum. During the day, while his father sat next to the well, he played on the drum alone in the tent that was their home. He also played it to greet the caravans that came to the well for water. At night, when the desert was totally silent, the boy made up the songs he would sing the following day as he played his drum, and some of them were quite beautiful. All over the desert, the little boy became known as the drummer boy. One night, a big, mysterious star appeared in the desert sky. The star was much brighter than any other, and it seemed to move in the direction of a nearby village called Bethlehem. Most of those that saw it were frightened by it, but the little drummer boy was not afraid. This star that shone so high in the heavens was too beautiful to be a bad sign. It seemed to announce something good was happening on the earth. So, taking up his drum, he played a song in honor of the star, just as he did when greeting arriving caravans. The star was still shining when a long line of shadows appeared out in the desert night. It was a caravan the likes of which had never been seen before. The animals were adorned with gold and precious stones, and walked more majestically than other animals. They were carrying heavy loads full of marvels. 3 kings preceded them.
Bearing gifts we travel so far, the
As soon as the cortege stopped in front of the tents and the animals had finished drinking, the kings explained to the people who pressed around them that they had been traveling for many days. They had seen the star in their faraway lands and had understood, because they were magi, that it shone in order to guide them to the stable where the child Jesus had been born. The small boy was not a wise man like the magi. He did not know that this child Jesus was the Messiah announced by the prophets, but he listened very attentively to everything being said. He was moved by the idea that this child Jesus was so poor that they had to lay him in a manger where the ox and ass eat. Fortunately, the kings were taking him gold, incense, and myrrh as presents. The little drummer boy wanted to go to see this child Jesus himself. He wanted to take him something, but he was poor and had nothing to offer. Suddenly, the little boy remembered his drum. Why not go and play for the child in the manger? Why not go and offer him, in the name of all poor boys, the most beautiful of his songs? The little boy left with the kings to Bethlehem. As soon as they arrived at the stable, he started to sing to the child, who smiled as he lay in between the ox and the ass. And then, oh marvel, the angels started singing along with him. One September morning in the year 1897, the editor of a New York daily newspaper called The Sun found a letter from an 8-year-old girl on his desk. The letter read,
Dear Editor, I am 8 years old. Some of my friends always tell me that Father Christmas does not exist. However, my father says that if the Sun says Father Christmas exists, then he really does exist. Please tell me the truth. Does Father Christmas really exist? Signed, Virginia O'Hanlon.
Francis Church, the editor of The Sun, reluctantly and with much hesitation, took upon himself the task of answering little Virginia's letter. However, once he had begun, the words came readily to mind. Here is his letter. Virginia, your friends are wrong. They have a terrible disease which later on will bring them even greater pain. Be careful not to catch this disease. This is a disease of the soul. We adults call it incredulity, cynicism, lack of innocence. Your friends and the other people who try to persuade you think they are wise and smart because they only admit as real that which they can see with their eyes and touch with their hands. But they do not realize how much they are limiting themselves. Little Virginia, imagine the whole of this immense globe with its lakes and mountains, with its rivers and seas, and hovering over our heads the infinite heavens with its thousands of stars. Imagine how many species of animals exist in the sea, in the air, and on the land. Man is only one among thousands of beings, and how small we are. In the face of the immense universe, man is but a fly or an ant. How then can man see everything that exists, or, with his limited understanding, try to explain everything? Yes, Virginia, Father Christmas exists. He exists just as much as tenderness and joy exist, or as love and goodness exist, even though we cannot see these things with our eyes and touch them with our hands. You yourself have felt these things, and don't they bring beauty and joy into your life? Oh, how sad the world would be without Father Christmas. It would be as sad as a world without Virginias, without fairy tales, the angels, songs, children's stories written by the poets. Or, on the contrary, imagine a world where no one ever became enchanted with anything, or never smiled. We then would all be lost, and that eternal light that never extinguishes, with which children light up the world and accompanies every child that is born, would be extinguished forever. Not to believe in Father Christmas, then no one would need to believe in fairies and angels. You could convince your father to put watchmen by every chimney on Christmas Eve so he could grab Father Christmas. What would be proven if they did not see him coming down the chimney? Nobody sees Father Christmas, but this does not prove that he does not exist. The things in this world that are really for real, neither children nor adults can see. Have you ever seen a fairy dance in the flowery meadows? Just because you have not seen them does not prove that they don't dance in the flowery meadow. No one can understand all the invisible marvels of the universe. You can disassemble a rattle in order to see how the sound of the little stones is produced. But there is a veil hiding the invisible world that nobody, not even the strongest man or the strength of the whole world, can push aside. Only faith and charity can raise this veil a little bit and thus be able to contemplate the beauty and splendor hidden behind. Is this reality? Oh, Virginia, on earth there is nothing more real or truer than this. Thanks be to God, Father Christmas lives and will live forever, for the next 1,000 years. Oh, little Virginia, for the next 10,000 years multiplied by 1,000 years, Father Christmas will continue to live in the pure hearts of children that are filled with joy and that beat with increased excitement on Christmas Day.
We have all heard the song The 12 Days of Christmas, a delightfully but apparently nonsensical rhyme set to music. However, it is a good deal more than just a repetitious melody with pretty phrases and a list of strange gifts. From the year 1558 to 1829, Catholics in England were prohibited by law from the practice of their faith. The religion was officially illegal until Parliament finally enacted the Catholic Emancipation Act in 1829. Until then, it was a crime to be a Catholic and to be faithful to the Pope. The 12 Days of Christmas was written as one of the catechetical songs to help young Catholics learn the tenets of their faith. It was a memory aid, when to be caught with anything popish would not only get you imprisoned, but possibly hanged, shortened by a head, or even subjected to the awful ordeal of being hanged, drawn and quartered. The 12 days refers to the period between Christmas Day and the Feast of the Epiphany, which is traditionally celebrated on the 6th of January. The gifts referred to in the song are in fact coded references to the teachings of the Catholic faith. The true love mentioned is God Himself. The me, who receives the presents, refers to every baptized person. The partridge in a pear tree is Jesus Christ, the Son of God. In the song, Christ is symbolically presented as a mother partridge, which feigns injury to decoy predators from her helpless nestlings. The pear tree represents the cross. The other symbols are as follows. 2 turtle doves refers to the Old and New Testament. For centuries, the Jews offered doves to God. The 2 doves remind us of the sacrifice Our Lady and St. Joseph offered in the temple at Jerusalem on behalf of our Lord. 3 French hens refers to the 3 theological virtues of faith, hope and charity. These hens were very expensive during the 16th century, and only the rich could buy them. They symbolised the 3 presents offered by the Magi to our Lord. Gold, the most precious of metals, incense used in solemn religious ceremonies, and myrrh, an exquisite spice. 4 calling birds refers to the 4 Gospels. The Gospels contain the life of our Lord and His teachings. Just like birds singing in a clear and loud voice, the 4 evangelists spread the good news of the life, death, and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ throughout the world. 5 gold rings refers to the 5 first books of the Old Testament, called the Pentateuch, which gives the history of man's fall from grace. The Jews considered these books more valuable than gold. It also reminded people of the 5 decades of the Holy Rosary. 6 geese a-laying refers to the 6 days of creation. They also remind us how the Word of God gave life to the earth. 7 swans a-swimming refers to the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit and the 7 sacraments. With the sacraments and the gifts, the faithful can sustain themselves in times of persecution. Just as cygnets change from ugly ducklings to become beautiful swans, so also does the grace of God transform us from mere creatures into children of God. 8 maids a-milking refers to the 8 Beatitudes preached by our Lord in the Sermon on the Mount. The Beatitudes, just like milk, feed and nourish the faithful. 9 ladies dancing refers to the 9 fruits of the Holy Spirit: charity, joy, peace, patience, benignity, goodness, longanimity, mildness and temperance. In the same way that ladies dance joyfully, so also can Christians rejoice with a life transformed by the fruits of the Holy Spirit. 10 lords a-leaping refers to the 10 commandments of the law of God. The lords were men of authority to govern and discipline the people. 11 pipers piping refers to the 11 apostles who remained faithful to our Lord after the infamous treason of Judas. As children followed the piper joyfully, the disciples accompanied Jesus. They also called others to follow him, and they play an eternal song, the message of salvation and life after death. 12 drummers drumming refers to the 12 articles of the Creed. In the same way that drummers play sonorously so others can accompany the rhythm of the music, the Creed reveals the faith of those who are Christians.
From 1793 to 1800, the region of Fougères in northeast France was the scene of the epic struggle of the Chouans. The Chouans were peasants who rose up against the French Revolution in defense of the monarchy and the church. One winter's night in 1795, a column of soldiers of the Revolutionary Republic was making its way along a path skirting a forest. Their steps were heavy. They were bored and they were tired from the enormous weight of the rucksacks and muskets they carried on their backs. They trudged along, leading a peasant prisoner who had tried to ambush them. The peasant had fired his musket at the sergeant, but the bullet passed through the man's hat, ricocheted off a tree, and broke a pipe that another soldier was smoking. The furious soldiers immediately set out in hot pursuit of the fleeing sniper. Hunted down and cornered against a cliff, the peasant had been captured and disarmed. Now he was following the soldiers, hands tied, with an forlorn look. His small, clear eyes watched the hedges along the path, as well as the windy paths that ran off in either direction. 2 soldiers wrapped the ends of the ropes tying his wrists around their arms. At the crossroads of Servilliers, the sergeant called a halt. The men, worn out, stacked their weapons and threw their rucksacks on the grass. They proceeded to gather up dry branches and leaves, from which they made a bonfire in the middle of the clearing. At the same time, 2 of them tied the peasant to a tree with the rope that bound his wrists. The Chouan watched everything that was going on very keenly. He did not tremble, nor did he say a word, but anguish could be seen on his features. He knew that death was at hand. His anxiety did not go unnoticed to one of the Blues, as the soldiers of the Revolution were known. This man had been detailed to keep a close eye on the prisoner. He was a slender adolescent, with a mocking and cutting tongue. He made fun of his prisoner, saying in a sharp Parisian accent, "Don't be afraid, Flower. You won't die just yet. You still have 6 hours to live." His comments were interrupted by a loud, gruff voice from across the clearing. "Tie him up well, Pete. We can't let him fly away." "Don't worry, Sergeant Torquatus. We need to take him in one piece to the General." Then the lad went back to his mocking. "You know, you dog, don't think you're going to be treated like those nobles. The Republic's not rich, and there's a shortage of guillotines. But don't worry, you'll get your share of lead bullets. 6 to your head and 6 to your body. So that's something for you to think about till tomorrow morning. It'll keep you entertained." The peasant stood as if not hearing. An impenetrable look settled over his face. Having said this, Private Pete went and sat by his companions by the fire. Taking a piece of coarse bread from his rucksack, he began to eat it tranquilly. Having finished eating, Pete started to clean his musket. He chose a bullet, and holding it delicately in his hands, said to the peasant who was following his every movement, "See this, my child? This one's for you." And he put the bullet in the chamber. Everyone started to laugh, each trying to outdo the other in the macabre game of tormenting the unfortunate prisoner. "I've an equally good dose for you," one shouted. "You're going to be like a sieve," another joked. "I will be last. One for each ear," guffawed Sergeant Torquatus. And then, in a sudden fit of rage, he came up to him. "Oh, you wretched chewin'. I would like to kill 1,000 of you with one shot." The peasant was silent and calm under this barrage of threats. He seemed to be listening to a faraway sound that the shouts and laughter of the soldiers made it difficult to hear. Suddenly, he dropped his head and concentrated. From the depths of the forest, one could hear the sound of a bell ringing in the night. It sounded high and clear as it came on the breeze. Then the wind shifted into the north, and immediately another bell, deeper in tone, began to sound. Soon another joined in, this time more melancholic, coming from another direction. The Blues had fallen silent with surprise and apprehension. They too strained to hear. "What's this?" asked the sergeant. "Why are the bells ringing? Is this a signal? The bandits must be sounding the alarm." Then they all started shouting together, some at the prisoner, some at each other. Many reached for their weapons. The peasant raised his head, and gazing at them serenely, he said, "It is Christmas." "It's what?" replied the sergeant. "Christmas. They are ringing the bells for midnight mass." The soldiers felt foolish and began to curse, then grumble, then fall silent as they took their places once more around the fire. For a while, no one spoke. Christmas. Midnight mass. They had not heard these words for a long time. It stirred vague memories of happier times, of long-forgotten tenderness, of peace. With heads hung low, they heard those bells that spoke a forgotten language. Sergeant Torquatus put his pipe down, crossed his arms and closed his eyes, as one savouring a symphony. Then, ashamed at this sign of weakness, he turned to the prisoner and asked in a severe tone, "Are you from this area?" "I'm from Cogley, not too far from here." The sergeant became interested. "So, there are priests in your town?" "The Blues have not taken everything. They have not crossed the Quesnon River, so on that side one still lives in freedom." "Can't you hear? It is the bell of Paris that is ringing now. That other, smaller one is from the castle of the Lord of Boisguy. And that one further off is the bell of Montour. If the wind were right, we could even hear the big bell of Londian." One of the soldiers, called Gilles, had been silent while the others had been threatening the Chouan. He now listened attentively and seemed to be moved. The others, after a momentary feeling of tenderness, had already closed their hearts. At that moment, from every point of the compass, the tolling of faraway village bells could be heard. It was a sweet melody that rose louder or softer depending on the wind. Gilles hung his head and listened. He thought of things forgotten long ago. He saw the church of his native village, resplendent with lighted candles, the manger with its big stones covered in moss where the little red and blue lamps shone. He heard in his memory the joyful Christmas hymns that had been sung for generations. They were innocent hymns, as old as France, speaking of shepherds, flutes, stars, and children, of peace, pardon, and of hope. He felt his heart melt in the good warmth of these gentle images he had for so long forgotten. The bells continued to toll from afar. Torquatus ordered everyone to sleep and put Gilles on the first watch. It took no time at all to set up an improvised camp, and the Blues, exhausted by the day's toils and wishing to forget the sound of those bells that had brought them so many memories from their happy childhoods, snored away, stretched out on their sleeping mats. The fire still crackled, but less so. Only Gilles and the Chouan were awake. The Blue then went over to where the Chouan was tied up. "Do you know," the soldier said, "where I come from? We used to make a huge manger in the church, and we would place the infant Jesus there, surrounded by Our Lady and Saint Joseph." And then he suddenly said, "Do you want to go free?" "What about you? They will tear you to pieces." "I'll go with you. I'm fed up with this rag of a war. Anyway, I was enlisted without a choice. My family's Catholic. At home, from my earliest days, they taught me to respect the king." "Then come with me," the Chouan answered. "Be faithful once again. I will take you to a priest so you can go to confession. Together, we will fight for our Lord Jesus Christ and the king." The Blue said no more, but took his knife from his pouch and sliced the ropes that bound the prisoner. It was not long before both had slipped away into the blackness of the night. One could no longer hear the bells in the wind, but they continued to ring in the hearts of the two men. It was Christmas.
In the 7th century, a monk from Crediton, Devonshire, went to Germany to teach the Word of God. His name was St. Boniface. He did many good works there and spent much of his time in Thuringia, a region later to become the centre of the Christmas decoration industry. Tradition has it that St. Boniface used the triangular shape of the fir tree to describe the Holy Trinity of God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The converted people began to revere the fir tree as God's tree, as they had previously revered the oak. By the 12th century, it was being hung upside down from ceilings at Christmas time in Central Europe as a symbol of Christianity and was referred to as the Tree of Christ. The first decorated tree was at Riga in Latvia in 1510, while the first Christmas tree came to England with the Georgian kings from Germany. At this time also, German merchants living in England decorated their homes with a Christmas tree. The British public were not fond of the German monarchy, so did not copy the fashions in vogue at court, which is why the Christmas tree did not become established in Britain at that time. In 1846, the popular royals, Queen Victoria and her German Prince Albert, were featured in the Illustrated London News. They were standing with their children around a Christmas tree. Unlike the previous royal family, Victoria was very popular with her subjects, and what was done at court immediately became fashionable. The English Christmas tree had arrived. On the more profound meaning of the Tree of Christ, the late Professor Plinio Correa de Oliveira explains, each feast of the liturgical calendar brings an effusion of special graces with it. Whether men want or not, grace knocks at the door on their souls in a more sublime, meeker, more insistent way during the Christmas season. The Christmas tree, with its beautiful decorations, lights, and star or angel on top, helps to elevate the soul above the materialistic aspects of modern-day Christmas. The tip of the tree points to a marvellous world that is heaven. To show how the introduction of the custom of the Christmas tree was a gradual process and how it favours the elevation of the ambience, we will tell the story of a Catholic family in Austria, as written by P. Rosiger in his book Peasant Life in Styria. It had long been a great desire of mine to put into practice something I had heard was done in other towns to celebrate Christmas. One should put a small fir tree on the table, affix candles to its branches, and place presents for the children underneath, explaining that it had been the child Jesus who had left them there. So I had the idea to set up a tree of Christ for my little brother, Nicorel. But I needed to do this secretly, part of the procedure, and before my mother entered the kitchen to prepare breakfast. As soon as there was enough light, I went out into the cold. I hid my gaze from those working around the house, and when I returned from the forest with a small fir top, I ran to the barn where the horse carts were kept to hide it there. It was soon night. The servants were still busy with the stables and in the bedrooms, where, according to the custom of Christmas Eve, they washed their heads and put on festive clothes. My mother was in the kitchen preparing her typical Christmas sweets, and my father was with little Nicorel, going around the property blessing it with incense, praying all the while. It was necessary to expel the evil spirits and attract angelic blessings to the house. Thus, while everyone was busy with their tasks, I prepared the tree of Christ in the main room. I took my tree from its hiding place and put it on the table. I then cut 10 or 12 candles from the wax block and placed them on the branches. Underneath, I put some sweetbread. I heard some slow and gentle steps on the floor above. I knew it was my father and my little brother who were there blessing the loft. They would soon be coming to the main room. I lit the candles and hid behind the stove. The door opened, and they entered with the incenser and then stopped. "What is this?" my father asked in a low but prolonged voice. The little Nicorel looked on dumbfounded. In his big, round eyes were reflected the lights of the tree of Christ, like little stars. My father advanced slowly to the kitchen door and called in a low voice, "Wife, wife, come and see this." And when she came, he asked, "Did you do this?" "Mary and Joseph!" my mother exclaimed. "What did you put on the table?" The servants soon arrived and were very impressed with the unexpected surprise. So one of them suggested, "Maybe it is a tree of Christ. Could it be that the angels brought this little tree from heaven?" They all contemplated and marvelled at the tree, and the smoke of the incense filled the whole room and formed a delicate veil that rested on the illuminated tree. My mother looked around the room for me. "Where is Peter?" I thought it was the moment to come out of my hiding place. I took Nicorelle's cold hands, who was still dumbfounded and continued rooted to the spot, and took him close to the table. He almost resisted, but I told him in a very solemn tone, "Do not fear, my little brother. Look, the dear child Jesus brought you a tree of Christ. It is yours." And the young boy was overjoyed and folded his hands like he did when he went to church. As we mentioned earlier, the top of a Christmas tree points towards a marvellous world, the world of heaven. In this light, let us consider an enchanting tale about a Christmas tree. The story elevates one's spirit to a higher plane, thus satisfying our desire for that which is marvellous. Pious legend recounts that when the shepherds went to adore the divine infant, they decided to take him fruits and flowers from the area. After this harvest, the plants congratulated themselves on being able to offer something to their newly born creator. One had given its dates, another its nuts, and so on. From the fir tree, however, the shepherds had taken nothing, because its needle-like leaves and sharp cones were not presentable gifts. The fir tree recognized its unworthiness, and not feeling worthy to participate in the conversation, prayed in silence. "My newly born God, what can I offer you? I offer you my poor and unworthy existence. This I gladly give you in gratitude for you having created me in your wisdom and goodness." God was pleased with the humility of the fir tree, and as a reward, ordered a multitude of little stars to come down from heaven to adorn it. The stars were made of many colours: gold, silver, red, blue. When a group of shepherds passed by, they not only took the fruits of the other plants, but they also took the whole fir tree, as such a marvel had never before been seen. Thus, the fir tree ended up by decorating the grotto of Bethlehem, being placed very close to the child Jesus, Our Lady, and St. Joseph.
The song Silent Night is by far the most symbolic of Christmas carols. It is understandable, then, that we might wonder about the origin of such an extraordinary song. To tell the story of its origins, we must start at the court of Frederick William of Prussia, the fourth king of that name, just after his ascension to the throne in 1840. It was Christmas Eve. In Berlin, the king and his court were commemorating the birth of Christ. The cathedral choir, directed by Felix Mendelssohn, was playing one of the pieces from his repertoire. It was the song Silent Night. The king was very impressed by the beautiful song and wondered who the author might be. He examined his program with the list of hymns being sung and was surprised to see that the author was unknown. The King of Prussia could not permit such imprecision. So, immediately after the ceremony, he had the director come to see him. However, Mendelssohn was not able to shed any light on the matter. He then called the head of royal concerts, Ludwig, who had the reputation of being able to discover the origin of unknown songs. But, to Frederick William's disappointment, he knew nothing either. So, the king then ordered Ludwig to find out, because Prussian hymn books had to be in proper order. Now that Ludwig had his reputation on the line, it was imperative that he discover who the composer of the song was. He scoured the libraries, cities, principalities, and kingdoms of what was then Germany, but all to no avail. The song hunter, as they started to call Ludwig, noticed that the style of the music seemed Austrian. So off he went to Vienna, but again drew a blank. However, an old musician from Haydn's day gave him a clue. Michael Haydn, the brother of the famous musician, composed many works that had been lost. Could this Christmas song perhaps be one of those? The old man suggested. It was a long shot, and Ludwig wasn't encouraged. So, giving up his search, he decided to return to court. During the return trip, while he was staying at an inn, he noticed a cage bird singing a familiar song. He leapt to his feet, startled. Ludwig realized the bird was singing that mysterious Christmas song whose author he was looking for. It was singing Silent Night. "What happened?" the innkeeper asked. "The bird," answered Ludwig. "Who taught the bird that song?" The innkeeper did not know, but he added that a friend of his had bought it at the abbey at Salzburg and left it at the inn for the entertainment of guests. The Abbey of Salzburg. Ludwig suddenly felt like a hunter who, after much fruitless searching, finds fresh tracks in the snow. The trail had become warm again. He knew that Michael Haydn had lived for quite a long time at that abbey, so it was almost certain that the song was Michael Haydn's. Ludwig lost little time changing his travel plans and making his way to the abbey. Upon arrival, the head of royal concerts of the Prussian court was received with all the honors due to his office. The abbot and the monks offered him a good dinner and comfortable lodgings. But, lamentably, nobody knew the origin of the song. They much doubted the author had been Michael Haydn. When the song hunter told them about the cage bird, suggesting that the monks had taught it to sing that song, the abbot was offended, because such antics were prohibited in the monastery. Ludwig then examined all the manuscripts of Michael Haydn in the room where he had worked, and just as the monks had foretold, he found nothing. The trail was again gone cold. Discouraged, Ludwig began his journey back to the Prussian court. However, by chance, among those participating in the dinner offered by the abbot, there was a schoolteacher called Ambrosio Prestena, who was especially interested in the story of the bird. This could have been done by one of the boys in the abbey choir, he mused. Now, since the schoolteacher could imitate the bird perfectly, he decided to try out something in order to discover who had taught the bird this song. A few days later, he placed himself by a window that opened onto the inner courtyard of the school. He whistled, imitating the bird singing Silent Night. His ruse worked, because he soon heard a boy's voice saying, "So, little bird, you're back," and a 9-year-old boy came running out of class. How surprised the boy was to see he had fallen into a trap. "What is your name?" the teacher asked. Felix Gruber, the boy answered. And tell me, Felix, where did you learn that song? My father taught it to me. And where did he get it? He composed it, sir. Without losing a minute, Prestena went to the boy's house in a nearby village. There he met the local schoolteacher, Franz Gruber, who said he had, in fact, composed the music, but the lyrics had been written by his friend Father Joseph Moore, parish priest of the village of Bagran, who had recently died. Overjoyed at finally finding the song's origin, Prestena wrote to Ludwig, the song hunter, telling him his quest to find the origins of the song were over. He sent Ludwig a full written account of how the song came about. And this is what he told him. It is Christmas Eve, and the tower of the small church of the village dominates the snow-laden houses of the town, like a hen protecting its chicks. In the presbytery, the young Father Joseph Moore, 26 years old, is reviewing the gospel in preparation for that night's ceremonies when a knock at the door breaks the silence. It is a peasant woman who asks the parish priest to help a baby that has just been born. Without delaying, the priest leaves the comfort of his home and, after a hard climb up the mountain, arrives at the humble abode where the child has been born. Upon his return, the stars shine in the heavens, reflecting their light on the whiteness of the snow. He begins to reflect on the scene he has just witnessed. The child, the peasant couple, and their humble home have all impressed him. They remind him of another child, another couple, another humble dwelling in Bethlehem of Judah. After midnight mass, Father Moore is unable to sleep. He takes pen and paper and begins to write a poem that will become the lyrics to the song Silent Night. The next morning, Christmas Day, 1818, the pious priest looks for a friend of his called Franz Gruber, then 31 years old. After reading the poem, Gruber exclaims, "Father, this is exactly the Christmas song that we needed. Praise be to God." And that very day, he composes the music to go with the words. And in this simple way, mirroring the events at Bethlehem, the most popular and beautiful Christmas song of all time was born.